In this short video, we're going to look at creating a for next loop in Visual Basic. A for next loop is normally used whenever you know exactly how many times you want the loop to execute. So you have a fixed number of times. It's always going to execute until the counter is reached, and that counter is automatically incremented by 1, meaning 1 will be added to the counter. The basic syntax for the for loop is for, and then your counter variable, equals whatever your starting point is to your ending point. And then whatever statements you want to have will go inside, and then next counter. So those highlighted here in this syntax are always going to be part. Now, the counter, your start and your end can only be integers. So start and end can be integer variables. Your counter is always going to be an integer variable, so you must always use whole numbers within a for next loop. Now, you're going to create the integer counter after the keyword for again. The first time that for loop executes, your counter is going to be set to whatever that start position is. This is the only time this happens. It does not reset each time the for loop executes. After the next is executed, that counter again, unless it's told otherwise, is always going to be updated by 1. That is the default value, a positive 1. Now, each time the for loop executes, the condition is going to be tested that's on that for line, and that's that end, for start to end. So if the condition is still true, then the counter is going to reach the value after the 2, and the loop will still execute. When that condition is false, then the execution is going to move on to the code outside of the for loop. Remember, the counter is updated to a false value and holds that value after you execute the loop. So let's look at an example. The loop below is going to execute until the number is equal to 5. So if inside this loop I had a me.lbl result.text equals num would be 4. If I moved that line outside of the for loop, the number would be 5, because it's going to increment at this point. It's going to loop back up, check this ending position, which is my condition, and not execute because it's going to be 5, and so it will go to the next line of code. You may create a variable called num in the for line by using the optional as integer. So I can have for num equals 0 to 4, or if I'm only going to be using whatever this counter variable is inside the loop, I can simply declare it here. Remember, we talked about scope several lessons back. And with scope, it's the amount of time that that variable can be used. So num in this example can only be used within this for loop, because once it goes to the next line does not know about num. So if you need this num value after your for loop, you want to declare it outside of the for loop, above it in code. So you would have dim num as integer, and then in the for loop, for num equals 0 to 4. Now, there is an optional step, and you can add that after the end value, and it changes the way the counter is incremented. Remember, by default, it's incremented by a positive 1. So it's going to take whatever the start value is, and it's going to add 1 to it. Step can be a positive or a negative number. So if I have for counter equals whatever my start is to whatever my end is, I can tell it to step and then whatever number I want here, and then within my statements. So if I only wanted odd numbers, I could say start 1 to whatever, step 2, and it would go 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and so on until it reached the end value. If I wanted even numbers, I could start at 0 and increment by 2. You could also increment by 5 or any other value that you need. Now, you can also step backwards, and when you step backwards, you want to make sure that this starting value is higher than your ending value. Because if I said step 1 to 5, step -1, then my next value would be 0, and that's automatically lower, and so it wouldn't execute anymore. So if I actually want this to execute and show counting down 5, and then 4, 3, 2, then 1, I need to make sure that when I step backwards, my start is larger than my end. Let's take a quick look at what this looks like in code. Oops. Okay, here's our code. So here is the code that we just had in our PowerPoint, and I'm going to execute that code. And so that you can see what happens, I'm going to hit loop backwards, and then it says counting down 5, and then it pops up the next one. Notice it going through its loop over here, and then it brings the next one, and then the next, and the next. Now here I've got counting down 1, and my ending value over here is 1. So when I click OK this time, it hit int y is equal to 0. It came back up. 0 is not 1, it's below 1, so it's going to stop executing. So that's how you count backwards. Now, I also told you that you could go by even numbers. Let's say I wanted to add up all even numbers between 1 and a number, and then I want to display that result in a text box. Again, remember, step is this function in Visual Basic that allows you to change how that's going to go. So let's go again back to our code, and we have that code below, and I'm going to loop by 2, and notice it didn't hesitate at all. It very quickly went through this. If I wanted to put in a breakpoint so that you could see this, I'm going to put a breakpoint in here so that we can see it increment, and run the code again. And then I will right click and add watch. Oops, I have to run it first. So loop by 2. Alright, notice that it pulled down my watch window with my variables, and it's now highlighted. So when I step, it's going to automatically increment. Notice I started at 0, so that's my first value. And now it goes by 2, and my I is at 2. Goes through again, and it's going to update. So I is now 4, and my result is 6. And it will keep going until it gets to an I of 250. So that's how you can have it step by a different number. You're incrementing or changing this counter variable so that it's going to change throughout. That's it for the for next loop.